Hi, welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar at Portland State University. Happy Halloween. My name is Chris Monsieur. I'm an associate professor in civil and environmental engineering, and my costume is a student. I'm dressed as a student today. I already used that joke once, so I had to use it again. So after I saw some other people who actually did go with costumes. So, but we're very pleased today to have one of our own Ph.D. candidates, Joe Broach, talking about impact of route level features on walking and bike decisions, and he even got Halloween in the title, Trick or Treatment. So I'll turn it over to you, Joe.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for coming out on Halloween. Trick or treat. I'm a spatial analyst. I don't know what all of you guys are, but just went with all the neutral tones today, and I think I'm good. So this is a lot of fun because it was several years ago that I presented on sort of the first round of this type of research that I got to do. And I mean, I've been really fortunate. It's not often that you get to do just the research that you want to do, but it's even rarer that you get to do it again, which for someone like me is pretty exciting. People that know me well know that I often will talk at length about why don't we ever get to replicate anything in this field, you know, like other fields do. And so pretty cool to be able to revisit something I did before. So what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of, there are all these route level features that we focus on. I mean, it's a big talking point in public policy that we're improving streets, we're adding facilities for cyclists, facilities for people walking. And then the question is, they can tell us that they want these things, or we can think about it from a design perspective that it's good, or from a safety perspective. But at some point, we have to see if people are actually getting use out of them, if they're showing by their sort of behavior that these route level improvements are attractive to them and are in some ways making their walking and biking a little bit better or easier. So, I mean, the basic concept is easy. If you look at any pair of potential routes, maybe these are two walking routes to get somewhere that you want to go, there are going to be differences in the attributes along those routes. Sometimes the differences are quite stark, and sometimes they're at a sort of a more subtle level that only someone who used the facility a lot would know. But the thrust of the research is that it's these route level decisions that are sort of key for how people walk and bike. And then a follow-up question, maybe it's key in whether they walk and bike at all. So here's sort of the conceptual view, and any of you that happen to see my 3-minute thesis have seen this slide before, but this is how it sort of goes around in my head. There's someone who has decided to go from A to B, and in this research I take that as a given. So that's already decided. And then the next thing they do is they think about the options for routes between the two places. And those route options may be different from mode to mode, right? They may have a route they would drive, but that might not be the route that they would walk or that they'd bike or be able to take transit. And so the consideration of how the trip would be along those routes, I think is key for then making a decision about how to travel and then which route to use. So just a little bit of backstory. I said that I'm sort of getting to do this again with the benefit of experience. And all this research sort of goes back to Jennifer Dill's bike GPS study, which at the time was really the first time anyone on any kind of large scale for research had collected real data on where cyclists ride in just the everyday course of their lives. And it was a little bit different back then. They got handed something sort of like this. And so you can imagine that these volunteers had to be pretty keen, you know, to collect this data. They had a pretty chunky PDA with a GPS antenna, and then it had to be mounted somehow to the bike because this is, you know, it's not fitting in most jean pockets. So this is kind of where it started, and that data was collected in 2007, and then from sort of 2009 to 2011 is when I came into the project during that time and developed what now I kind of think of as Bike Model 1.0, and worked with Metro, with some data from the city of Portland and others, and developed a model that tries to explain why a cyclist would choose this route instead of another one that seems like a reasonable alternative. And by looking at the differences in the routes, the ones they choose, the ones they don't choose, we could start to see if some of these route level features were actually figuring in their decisions. So that was 1.0. And what happened was, it's kind of fortuitous that another study came along, the family activity study, again, one of Jennifer Dill's studies. And this time we're sort of, I mean, we were still behind even at the time, but it's getting a little bit better, right? So this new sample just had to clip this onto a pocket. And this time it was wearable. It wasn't just stuck to their bike. They were actually using this all the time for all their trips, biking, walking, transit and driving as well. But the data collection got a little easier, got a little bit easier to participate, I think, and the sample maybe was a little more representative, I think, of more of the average cyclist or pedestrian in Portland than the first, which they were, a good number of them were very regular cyclists. They were enthused about helping out with the effort. So from that, we had over 1,000 adults and children in Portland wearing GPS units for 2 5-day periods, excuse me. And from that comes this latest sort of round of research. So starting around 2012, even before the data had finished collection, I started thinking about how we could use this new data to sort of validate the bike model 1.0 and also add some things in. There were certainly were some lessons learned, but also just some questions about how representative are these 150 cyclists that volunteered for the first study, and what about pedestrians? So that's where we're going now. So that's why do it again? Well, one reason is just there's value in replication, especially when it's a fairly small sample. We developed a pretty sophisticated model just in that it looked at fairly low-level features like very detailed intersection variables. What if you're turning left across a lot of traffic and you don't have a signal protecting you, that sort of thing. And so things like that, you know, you want to see that more than one time before you're certain that it wasn't just something spurious, some spurious correlation with something else in the data. And it's neat to see it with a larger group of people. So that's one reason. How does that original bike model hold up if you throw fresh data at it? The second reason is that now we've got pedestrians on board because the device got smaller and the aims of the study were larger. And so we included pedestrian travel as well. And one thing we found at Metro is when you improve a competing mode, like cycling, we improved how we modeled that, and it caused us a lot of headaches on the pedestrian side because those two modes are competing with each other. So if for cycling you say, okay, when we reduce traffic, calm traffic, and add in bike facilities, it improves things for cyclists. What makes it look like it's more attractive to cyclists and pedestrians are still sitting there with their old just distance and land use mix maybe in the model. And so you have these competition problems that you have to sort of tamp down at every step. It's frustrating. So they almost have to be, you know, improved together. So that was exciting. Also, it's a totally different sample. As far as I know, there was no overlap, and they were recruited for a very different study. The family activity study was looking at general activity patterns of families in Portland. It wasn't focused on bicycling necessarily. It was more focused just on physical activity and moving around in Portland. So it would seem that it would attract a somewhat different sample, and I think it did. Also, the networks changed. We started with a 2007 network, and you know that's 7 years old now, and a lot of infrastructure has gone in. And as a lot of you know, are aware of, or have even worked on, there's been a lot of new and innovative infrastructure in Portland. So thought, you know, maybe we can at least begin to start thinking about these new bike facilities, like the buffered bike lanes on Stark and Oak, and the cycle track on Broadway, and the new one on Moody, although our data didn't quite cover that. But we wanted to start thinking about how to incorporate what happens when you have a whole new facility type that wasn't in the old data set. Finally, just sort of thinking about the piece of mode. So the route choice model tells us something about a cyclist that's already chosen to ride, right? So it tells us once they've decided to go from home to PSU by bike, how do they get there? But what it doesn't tell us if how those same features that affect their route choice might affect their decision to actually ride or not ride. So we don't know. We didn't know exactly because we didn't have a way to really re-estimate a mode choice model because we didn't have an old network then. We didn't have the new survey data, so we were sort of stuck with going by the route choice, which seems reasonable. If someone seems to prefer a path on a bridge rather than riding in traffic, it seems likely that that probably also plays into their choice of whether or not to ride at all. But we couldn't say for certain, so that was the final piece in the new round of research. So we've got some new data. I showed you the GPS units we used. You'll notice some sort of strange-looking study sites here on the map. And this was because this was actually a quasi-experimental study in that some of the zones, the ones in blue on the map, were getting bike neighborhood greenway treatments, formerly bike boulevard treatments, and the other zones weren't. And so an overarching goal of the study was to see if we could detect a behavior change in the families that were in the zones getting them. That's separate research. I'm just using the data, but you should know that the sample is a little weird, and for bike route choice modeling, it's weird in sort of an important way in that these neighborhoods were selected because they didn't yet have a nearby bike boulevard, right? So these are people who don't have one within, definitely don't have it within a quarter mile. Most of them don't have one within a half mile or a mile even. And so that was an interesting test of the model because in our bike model 1.0, we found, for the first time to my knowledge, we were able to see an observable impact of bike boulevards, those really simple additions to streets when they just do some traffic diversion, traffic calming, and signage to make the route a little nicer. And it attracted cyclists, but what if they don't live near them, right? Is it just going to be drowned out in the noise now? So that's why you do the new research. And we've got a new sample. I wasn't able to get a good comparison in time for today with the original bike GPS sample, but what I do have is just sort of the comparison with Multnomah County families in general. So these are all families with children between the ages of 5 and 16. So they're diverse, but they're within this demographic bin. And you can see that in general they match up fairly well, although it is a sample that's more white, more educated, and more likely to be homeowners than the average. But a sort of exciting piece for what I'm doing is that they do have, I'm not supposed to go in front of the screen, I was told. They do have pretty high levels of car ownership, so about a car per person, per licensed driver, and they also have a much larger group of the sort of interested but concerned that we're all interested in. What do they think about cycling? And we only got 6 or 7% of that strong and fearless category, which was, I'm sure we had a directly comparable question in the original bike GPS work, but I think it would have been quite a bit higher, judging from the data. So, new sample, new data. We've got walk data. We've got a new network. Things are getting exciting. So, just really briefly and without getting into the technical details at all, I just want to step you through sort of how I go about modeling bike route choice. So the first step is you've got to come up with a set of alternatives, because within an entire gridded network like Portland, the alternatives are almost infinite if you start thinking about every left turn and right turn you could take on your way biking from one place to another. So you've got to limit that set. And the important thing is that set needs to be representative of routes that a person would actually consider riding. That's the trick. And so what we do is label the alternatives. And by that I mean we find a route that, say, maximizes your use of bike facilities without deviating too far from the shortest path. Or it minimizes the steep grades that you have to climb. while still being the shortest route that does that. And that's step 2 when I keep saying that we've got to kind of limit where these routes can go. Because you can imagine from where you live, you can trace out a really circuitous route that uses lots of bike infrastructure, but pretty soon you're just doing a 40-mile loop. So what we do is we take all the label alternatives that we've spit out and all of these different ideas of what people might be looking for, and then we sort of calibrate that to the observed distribution of detours people are willing to make, right? And so if we look at a larger population and see there's this distribution that most people, 50% of people don't deviate more than 10 or 11% from the shortest path when they're cycling in Portland. And then as you go out into that tail, there's a little more. And so what we do is we try to fit the alternatives to that distribution that we observe over the population. So we think any one of these routes in any given situation at least seems like it's reasonable. It's something someone might have done, right? And then it's just a data exercise to get as much and as detailed data as we can. And in this round, the elevation data has improved since the last round. Now we've got the LiDAR data, which goes down to about 3-foot resolution, which is awesome when you're trying to line up an elevation model with a street, right, and trying to get the actual grade on the street and not fall off to the side in one direction or another. It also allowed me to elevate the bridges for the first time. The original model, all the bridges were flattened because we just couldn't get reasonable elevation data from it with the resources we had. So now the Morrison Bridge is as steep as it is in real life, and the Hawthorne is quite a bit flatter, as is and the steel, of course, is a pancake once you get down the ramps. So that was cool. There are always improvements in data as you do research over and over. We have traffic data that the city was great at providing back then, and Alex Bugazzi, who's here today, actually did some work to see if that holds up pretty well, and it turns out that, yeah, it's still pretty good. It'd be great if we could get new traffic estimates for all of the local streets, but we're still doing okay with what we got. Very detailed intersection data we look at, because I think any of you who have studied cycling, and especially cyclist safety, know that intersections are often the hot spots, right? That's where trouble happens and where people get turned off from riding a route. So we very detailed with the crossing volume, the through volumes, all the possible turning movements, and then the protection. So signals, whether they're bike or actual signals, car traffic signals and stop signs and all of that. And then the facilities. And so in the first round, we had local and regional multi-use paths, bike boulevards, non-neighborhood greenways, and we had bike lanes. In this study, we added buffered bike lanes and cycle tracks as well, not knowing exactly which category they might fit into. The other thing that has been added, Metro has added to the network since the last time I had my hands on it, is all those alleyways that maybe you have in the back of your place, especially if you live in Northeast or some parts of Southeast, out beyond where I live. So all the alleys are in there now, which was a new option on the grid. So after we do all this, estimate a model, like I said, what's happening is that we're comparing the attributes on the routes people chose with the attributes on the one they didn't choose. And what I'm going to put up here is the results together, because that was my first thing that I was particularly interested in. So the text may be slightly small, especially up in the legend, but the original study is the black bars. I'm sorry, this study is the black bars. The original study is the lighter gray bars, the bike GPS study. And I think what you'll notice right off the top is that, that's not bad. That's actually holding together pretty well. We see a few cases certainly where things vary quite a bit, but on the whole, it's not all over the place. It looks like Bike Model 1.0 had some staying power, even when we throw a different type of sample, new data, and 7 years of time in between the two networks. So what this is showing, for those of you who haven't seen one like this, is for each attribute, we can put it in terms of a common denominator. And in this case, I use distance because that's quite easy to think about. So if you take the top one there, if I can see my mouse here, yeah. So this is an off-street path. And in both studies, you see that for an off-street path, to use an off-street path, a cyclist would be willing to travel, anywhere from 37 to almost 40% farther than they would to use just a base level street. Just think of it as a quiet residential street with no facilities on it. And you can go down and kind of get a sense of the magnitude of some of the others. And then I'll talk in the remaining slides about some of those differences, but we can come back to this in the Q&A, and you can always get in touch with me if you want to sort of linger over it. But I don't want to spend all the time there because I want to get to some other cool stuff. So I think, like I said, the takeaway is that the results were surprisingly consistent in terms of non-commute trips. This was one sort of, I don't know, I wouldn't say limitation. This was just a different group of cyclists. So in our initial study, about a third of the trips were for a commute. These were regular cyclists. They were cycle commuters. They rode, a lot of them, daily. In this new sample, we only had about 10% of bike trips were to or from work. So quite a difference there. And so there was that difference. In the new model, we weren't able to see the distinction between a commute trip and a non-commute trip. In bike model 1.0, what we saw is that commuters were in a hurry. They were less willing to detour, even for a better facility. But in this case, we didn't see that sort of significant difference. Female cyclists held up again. It's kind of, it's shocking all the ways I look at segmenting by gender in both studies now has just been a completely negligible effect. The preferences are just almost identical. So this is, maybe this is a good thing. It means if we build good infrastructure, you don't have to build two separate types of infrastructure. You build it good, and it works for both genders, at least of those who are riding. Now, that's another question entirely. But the other thing, the facilities, we can go back and sort of look, but you've already seen that into the paths, bike boulevards, very similar, slightly higher in this new sample than the old one, which maybe would be expected given that they're less regular cyclists, maybe a little less confident. The bike lane was interesting in the original work. We tried a lot of ways to fit bike lane in, and what we found is that its role, at least statistically, and so we kind of inferred that practically its role was to segregate from traffic on a busy street, and it seems to do that, right? But in the first study, we found no sort of residual benefit from it. All it did was kind of cancel out the effects of that traffic to the side of it, which was a little surprising to people because a lot of people thought, well, on a busy street, even if there's a bike lane, it doesn't feel great. But here again, we have the same finding. Although in this case there was a small residual effect, but it's quite small. It's only around 5 or 6% willingness to detour to use a bike lane. Now, what we don't have, of course, is data to tell us what people would think about a bike lane on a very quiet street, like a bike boulevard. And, unfortunately, revealed preference data can only sort of speak through what's on the ground, and we don't have that. But it is intriguing, but I think we found pretty much the same thing. Bike lanes cancel out that traffic effect, but have a very limited sort of attraction of their own compared to paths and off-street facilities. Slope was quite similar. It even fit into the same neat 3 bands that sort of seem ridiculous, but you'll have to take my word for it that I tried a lot of permutations, both rounds, to sort of improve or disentangle that slope effect. And in each case, we found that it was at the 2% level, that 2% upslope, that people seemed to start noticing. Below that, it didn't seem to make a difference in their route choice. Then when it tips up to 4%, maybe like coming up the hill to PSU, then people notice quite a bit more. And then when you hit, like 6% or more, it looks like that label didn't quite get on the graph, but yeah, that got moved around. Sorry about that. Bridge's separated path is not correct, but that is the 6% and up slope range here. So that finding held. Traffic response was very similar, whether it involved just intersections or riding alongside traffic. It pretty much follows the road classifications in terms of traffic volume. So 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, and up. We did find that this group was a little bit more sensitive to traffic. We actually found a significant effect in that 5 to 10,000 band, which is interesting to those of you familiar with the greenways, because that's I think people talk around somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 as the max that would be tolerable on a greenway. And so interesting that we would find that's where people start to seem to want to find other routes to get around it. So what about these new facilities? Well, unfortunately, they appeared in very few of the choice sets. As you are probably aware, unless you live and work or go to school in just the right places, right now they don't get you a lot of places. So they were not in a lot of choice sets. I will say that while not significant, they did have the expected signs and magnitudes. They did seem to be positive attractors, but they just weren't on enough people's map yet to show up as significant. So it's going to take more research, and either more of the facilities or more focused research, I think, similar to some of the Green Lane work that's been going on here at PSU and elsewhere, to sort of pinpoint, because we want to know where do they fall in that sort of spectrum, right? Because we've kind of set out this hierarchy of off-street paths seem to be most preferred by Portland cyclists, and then neighborhood greenways or bike boulevards, and then bike lanes least, although they still have an important effect on busy roads. And what we want to know is a buffered bike lane, is it more like a path, or is it more just like another, it's just a bike lane separating you from traffic? And that's a question that's going to take some more time and data to answer. That's all I can speak to with this data. What happened to the Burnside Bridge? So despite my poor labeling over there, you can see here in the original survey, bridge with bike lane to make it for a general audience. But as we know in Portland, that's pretty much limited to the Burnside, right? And so it disappeared in the sample. Why was that? Well, it wasn't even estimable because no one in our sample of 1,400 trips used the Burnside Bridge through the collection period. Intriguing. So it's we just can't speak to it with the new data. That was kind of a shock. I went back a couple of times to see if I had made a mistake, but no, it's true. You can't do much if no one uses it in your study. So like I said, there were some differences with commuting. There was more sensitivity to traffic. Bike lanes did seem to have a small but statistically significant residual draw. Like I said, people would go 5 or 6% out of their way to hit a bike lane, even after you account for everything else. So nearby neighborhood greenway would still win them over because it's got this sort of stronger pull. But bike lane does seem to have some value beyond just protecting from traffic for some segments. This group was a bit less sensitive to delay as well in terms of just number per mile of traffic signals and stop signs. And in fact, stop signs were very slightly positive, though essentially zero in terms of willingness to go out of their way. And wondering if that could be related to some land use variables that I still need to pick up. Maybe that's picking up some quieter neighborhoods with high stop sign density. The alleyways and unpaved streets I mentioned for a moment. I'll mention it more in the pedestrian, but this added an interesting, sort of change to the modeling. We didn't have them before. Now we added them, so we needed to control for them. And what do you think? Loved? ignored, reviled? What would you guess for cyclists? I think ignored is probably the right answer. They get very little use, and at least statistically speaking, they're a big turnoff, and for reasons that are probably clear to some of you that live nearby, but kind of were surprising to me until I talked to people, because I have lived in places where they're quite useful, but I think in Portland the alleys are sort of unique. We've got the really short blocks, so they're not buying you a lot, and we don't really use them for anything. We rarely seem to have the garages backing on them or anything else, but I don't want to linger on it. But I did think it was interesting because this seems like, wow, what a cool addition, to our bike and pedestrian network. And then when it comes to modeling, we find out, oh, well, pedestrians and cyclists are not interested, at least in their current state. But, maybe the next untapped resource for one of you do an exciting project to make this a little bit better. So that was the bike, and with the bike, I had a little more to say because we had that comparison case, and that was, it was really neat. Also, I feel good knowing that the original bike model was not just, reliant on that single sample or that single point in time. It seems like the sort of things we found there do hold up. Bike facilities do seem to be attractive to cyclists, which is great. That's the point, right? So there we are. So now to pedestrian route choice. So this is kind of a new world. Most pedestrian route choice that has been done before has been done not for everyday travel purposes, but for either marketing research, like how people move through a mall or through some sort of event or grocery store, or it's been for evacuation and emergency preparedness. How can we get a whole lot of people out of here, and how are they going to behave? So this is a new way of thinking about it, and taking a step back and thinking about someone making really series of decisions about how they're going to walk based on the routes available to them. So again, we have a person who's already decided to go from A to B, and now we're at the stage of modeling their choice of which route to use to get there. And this was tricky because with cycling, I talked about the labeled routes. It was pretty easy to put together a pretty good set from survey responses we have of different things that cyclists are looking for. So they don't like to climb steep hills. They like to use bike lanes, bike boulevards, bike paths when possible. They like to avoid traffic. They like to avoid unnecessary delays and all that. But with pedestrians, the literature is a lot sparser. And there are a lot of people who think maybe it's essentially random. You walk to one block and then you turn and you walk to the next block. Or you go by the traffic signals when you're walking downtown. A lot of people told me I should look at that, right? And so I used, instead of labeling the routes, to generate that choice set of walking routes, what I did is actually do a random walk, but again, anchored around the shortest path. So a path like that, each time it hits an intersection, it makes a sort of probabilistic choice for each alternative, and it turns or doesn't turn one way or the other, but those probabilities are weighted toward that sort of anchor shortest path, because we know just from looking at our data profile that cyclists, pedestrians just like cyclists, actually maybe even more so, don't like to take big detours. Those routes are probably not under consideration most of the time. And then just it's quite a data challenge. I mean, we were stretching the sort of essentially an auto network for cycling, and imagine how much farther we're stretching it, right, for pedestrians. It's getting pretty thin, because you think of a pedestrian coming up to an intersection, and with a car or a bike, you can think pretty simply of the movements that they can make, right? But a pedestrian has another way of moving. They can cross the street, and you don't necessarily know where, even with pretty good GPS data, right? And so what if you think they're on the right and there's no crosswalk, but there's actually a crosswalk if they just cross the street and then went across that way? So you have to, at the intersections, it becomes very complex. But I did try my best to model it in sort of a rational way, so that someone couldn't just keep hopping back and forth across the street, but they could do it when it seemed reasonable to access, say, a crosswalk or a signal or something like that. It also looked, we thought, we've tried land use variables with cycling, adjacent land uses, and just haven't seen much of significance. And it seems that cyclists are pretty much still sort of in that road environment most of the time, right? They're more clued in to what's going on with their facility, with the terrain, the traffic, and everything, and not so much what's next to them. At least that's what we found so far. With pedestrians, we thought, well, it seems like that's going to be different. We're moving another quite a few steps over toward the block face, and so we wanted to measure the land use sort of as a pedestrian would see it rather than bird's eye view like you often see. So we actually measure along the block face, so percentage of the block face that is commercial or mixed use or residential and that sort of thing. And so then it's, well, what's a walk trip? That's another thing that comes up with bikes. Most bike trips are pretty simple. People don't get into as many complex trip chains with bikes, but of course with walking it could just be the end of your car trip, right? But that's often not a very interesting trip when it comes time to model it, because there often are few options, or it's a trip that someone never takes twice, right? Because you have to find a parking place and then just beeline toward a building. So we limited it to walking to a destination, that was your primary mode, or to access transit. And we had a small but significant number of those trips, walking trips. And we also limited it to about a quarter mile and up, 400 meters, because that gave them at least enough blocks in Portland to work with to actually make a decision. Otherwise, you get into a lot of sort of captive cases where any alternative is just bizarre, going around a block instead of just walking to the end of the block. So that was our set to analyze. Just like with the bike routes, we have all these randomly generated alternative paths, and then we have the paths they actually chose, which we joined to the network from GPS data. And here's an interesting difference. I didn't really highlight it in that bike graph before, but with the original bike model, we beat our heads against it for a while and finally realized that bike decisions and trips are very sensitive to the length of the trip. So the amount you're willing to detour is tied to that total length of trip. It was very clear in the data and the modeling that someone who wouldn't detour a mile on like a 2-mile trip might detour a mile for a 5-mile trip. It was more proportional to the length of the trip. With pedestrians, that turned out not to be the case, and maybe that's not too surprising because most of these trips are pretty short. But the result is that instead of those kind of difficult percentages, for some variables at least you can actually put it in terms of just straight distance. So you can put the effect of the variable in terms of meters in this case. I probably should have changed this to feet, but I tend to work in meters and forget to switch back. But so you can see here the different attributes that turned out to be significant. And then this first group, and I should point with the mouse for the people online, is per each additional. So for each additional turn on a route, a pedestrian in our sample would have been willing to go about 54 meters farther if they could avoid that turn. So there seemed to be, some kind of either wayfinding effect or just maybe it's just inertia has been suggested to me. Pedestrian model, incidentally, it turns out to be a great bar conversation starter because everyone walks and everyone seems to have a lot of opinions about it, which is great. And I've learned so much from people saying, it may not be that they, can't find their way. It just, you start down one street, you kind of want to stick with it. So I go, maybe so. But there is a reluctance to turn more than you need to. And then as you move down, to avoid an unsignalized arterial crossing where there's no pedestrian signal, willing to go quite a bit further. Now we're getting to the distance that is, getting close to a Portland block at 73 meters. So they're willing to go an entire block out of their way to sort of access these pedestrian signals on an arterial. Collector crossing without a marked crosswalk, willing to go a little ways. I'll come back. Hopefully we'll have time to look at a quick example of that at the end, which is kind of fun. Possibly a misuse of models, but even modelers have to have fun now and then. as we move down now, these variables, because of the way they're measured, have to be sort of a change in perceived distance while you're under this sort of condition. So for pedestrians, remember cyclists, they started noticing a 2% upslope. We couldn't find a statistical effect on pedestrians until it got steep, until we got to a 10% wall, which is perhaps not surprising and perhaps a good reminder of the limitations still of our sample, that these were people who were able to walk and cycle. They were physically, they were attracted to a study on physical activity. So this is might not carry over to elderly or people with very young children. But they were, it felt twice as long if you were on a 10% upslope, which seems reasonable to me. There's the unpaved alley effect. It felt half again as far, which sort of geometrically neatly cuts it out as a shortcut, more or less, if it's half again as far, because it's rarely going to save you that in Portland. A busy street, so this is down to the collector or larger, just walking along that busy street with the traffic to your side, that cost you an extra sort of 14% as an equivalent distance. It felt longer when you're walking next to busier traffic. Here was an interesting one, and the only block-faced land use to sort of show up so far in the research, but kind of cool that pedestrians were attracted to what I'm terming neighborhood commercial zones, and these are commercial developments on less than an arterial class street, and so we can argue about definitions or not, but I tried a lot of permutations, and this seemed to be a stable relationship, that they were attracted rather than walking, say, one block over on a residential street. They were willing to go a little bit farther and walk along the neighborhood commercial strip. It's been suggested to me that maybe this is because they hadn't decided a destination yet, right? So maybe my assumption that they're going from A to B is not quite right. They may be going from A to somewhere in the vicinity of B, right? And if they hit that neighborhood commercial strip sooner, they have more to choose from. And that was pretty clever. I just thought it would be, it was just more interesting and maybe a little bit nicer walking environment. But I think either could be good, and shows the value of some qualitative follow-up research to some of this too. Finally, and this was a bit of a strange one. This is one that I would probably wait till the next study, that last one, to really hang my hat on. But if someone is traveling, and we only knew if it was with another family member, because someone in the household also had a GPS, and we could link them together. We didn't have diaries. So we don't know if this would apply to someone outside of the household or not. But when they're walking with them, a detour feels longer. So I don't know. Maybe in the Q&A, think about it a minute and get back to me. This is one that no one has answered yet, not to my satisfaction or theirs. You think about it and you think, gosh, so they're arguing about route unless they just go the shortest way, or yeah. So an interesting result that in the pedestrian model that I haven't seen anything quite like that on the bike side. So. Yeah, and yeah, but there is no difference between limiting it to just a child or another adult in the house. The effect was the same, not distinguishable. So intriguing. So compared with cyclists, I mean, a lot of the things sort of hold up. The one thing you probably noticed that was missing there were sidewalks. Usually you would imagine in any sort of survey of pedestrians, they'd say, yeah, sidewalks are important. And this could be another case of, the data can't tell us a lot about what's not there. And so these people, as you saw on the map, the majority of them are living in fairly inner Portland. Sidewalk coverage was very high on routes that were walked. Over 80% of the streets had complete sidewalks on both sides of the street. And so the truth is there just wasn't a lot of option to not use a sidewalk, aside from those unpaved alleys and unpaved streets, So there's an effect that's sort of bound up together that couldn't be disentangled. I certainly wouldn't say that there's no effect of sidewalks. I just think that the coverage is to the point it's hard to detect it here. Intersections, so very important to pedestrians. That told about the wayfinding inertia effect. Roadside traffic does have an effect, but as we would expect, it is a little bit weaker. It's only when you're interacting with it at those crossings that it really starts to show up to a large extent. I pointed out the neighborhood commercial adjacent land use. Pedestrians are a bit less willing in general to make a detour. When you kind of stack all of the numbers together, they're less likely to go out of their way than a cyclist. More energy expended, per distance. Maybe it's as simple as that. Maybe there's more to it. And finally, there's that traveling with others. I'll be interested to hear if you have something else. So when I signed up, I had hoped that I would be able to share with you a little bit more, although who knows how I would have done it in this time allotment. But in the green boxes is what I showed you today, but this is my overall goal here, this framework. And the gray boxes are done but not presented today. And the last step is sort of coming this winter, so I guess watch out for my dissertation defense. And you can hear about how these route level factors actually influence the choice of whether or not to bike and walk at that. So just a couple of quick little tidbits, and then I'll get to the questions. But this was fun. This is a spot on my route where they installed a new crosswalk, and I thought, I really apologize in advance if you are someone who understands design and engineering, or even worked on this and knows why it's there. Right? But for just someone from the peanut gallery like me that rides through here all the time, I thought, why would they put it so far from the two bus stops? So this is southeast Milwaukee. And that's the Springwater Trail access there to your left, and to the right is Arts and Crafts building. And there are two bus stops at the lower end of that red line, one on each side of the street. And so, and between that and the park access, there's a lot of activity crossing there. And when they put the crosswalk up there toward McLaughlin, I thought, what in the world, I'm sure there's a great reason for it, but I thought it would be fun to look at it with the model in mind. The model says a pedestrian would be willing to go about 30 meters out of their way to use a crosswalk. But, of course, this would take, well, if you were trying to cross the street to the other bus stop, it'd take you 50 and then 50 to get back. So that is maybe not surprising that they're often dodging traffic crossing there. Don't know. There's probably a good reason, like I said, maybe something to do with the driveway and that sort of thing. But kind of just an idea of this is too detailed to use a model like this, really, but just to get you thinking about how you could use this in kind of scenario planning in a larger scale. I mean, here's a question I've been pondering, right? The new bridge, Tillicum Crossing. I ride under it every day going home, and it's pretty steep. From what I understand, it's going to be a steady grade of about 4.5%, which, if you remember from the model, puts it into that category that really starts to turn people off, so that if it's competing, say, with the Hawthorne Bridge, a quarter mile climbing that ramp is going to feel about the same as a mile on the equivalent of the Hawthorne Bridge grade. So it's going to have to overcome that with the good infrastructure that's going to be at the ends. And so it would be very interesting, once I get to the mode choice portion of the model, to look at those effects and see sort of the bridge shed for the new bridge, right? Who might it attract? You would think maybe the tram, would have an edge there despite the slope, just because it's such a good connection. But for PSU, and I know there's already been some discussion about maybe a missed opportunity there, but I do tend to agree the slope will be a factor. Building it with that amount of clearance is going to have an effect on cycling. Probably not walking, although there the length may be the issue. So I should say, like I said, I've been really fortunate to get to do this research not once but twice, and have tons of support with data and analysis and funding. And so I want to thank Jennifer, who's here, John Glebe, who's now gone from PSU, and my whole dissertation committee, Kelly and Jim and Bob Fountain. Also, Trek, now Trek, for support, and Robert Wood Johnson funded a lot of the data collection for this second round. And Metro and Peabody, I mean, none of this would have happened without those partnerships, because we just wouldn't have had the data to do any of this cool stuff. And they're maintaining it so well. Like I said, I kept getting exciting surprises when I get new data releases from Metro. It's great to have them. And then Geostats helped us, and then a raft of grad students who have worked on this data over the years and sort of made it happen. Nathan's here, and maybe someone else who worked on it is here. They're all over. So with that, I will conclude, and I think I left us a little time, hopefully, to chat a little bit. Sometimes I'm afraid my enthusiasm for this gets a little out of hand speaking about it, but it's fun to sort of see these things done and think back to where it started. So I appreciate you bearing with me and being a great audience. And yeah, open it up to, or you know, if you've got a thought about that pedestrian question. Yeah.
I remember if you're a student, just say in your one credit per question, say your name at the beginning. Daryl.
I was just curious what kind of interaction the users had with the equipment. Was it always on? Did they have status?
Yeah, good point. In the most recent study, they needed to remember to turn it on if they were in a place for a long time, and so we definitely did miss some trips. I noticed that there were more trips, you know, going to work than departing work. I think that was the tricky one for people to remember at the end of the day. You know, I mean, I leave everything in the office, so I'm not surprised they didn't go back on. Yeah, so they had very limited interaction. All they saw were, you know, the batteries are probably dead, but they just saw lights saying if they had signal or not, and if they had battery, and if it was on, and that was the extent. In the earlier study, they had a little more interaction. They actually could input some things because the thing was basically a PDA. So yeah. Does that wording mean anything to anyone anymore? Yeah, I had one once. Yeah. Good question. Alex?
Alex Briazzi. In Sam Thompson's defense this morning, he found one of the variables associated with cyclist non-compliance was, one of the few significant variables was households with children in them, which was basically associated with less risk-taking behavior. And I'm wondering if you think that might influence some of the coefficients you estimated, or do you think it was adequately controlled for with other things?
No, I think it definitely does. I have not yet found any difference when a kid is on the trip versus not, but there's still that overall effect of just, I'm a parent, you know, maybe I'm going to be more cautious. I'm not a parent, so I'm just speaking in the air here. But yeah, so I think, you know, it sort of speaks to triangulating with the two samples. So this one, yeah, I would expect, just thinking about it, these are all parents with kids, younger kids, a lot of them with younger kids, that, you know, they would be more cautious, and that would help to explain the effects, like they're more sensitive to traffic even at lower volumes. They're a bit more attracted to the bike facilities, the safer bike facilities, and less in less of a hurry, perhaps, which was an interesting one on the commute tips that we did capture. So, yeah, I think it's something I want to explore more, though, with kind of the composition of who's on the trip and what the trip is for. But we shall see. Thanks. Yeah, in the back there.
I was curious about whether you had any opinion on whether traffic signal prioritization would have an effect. There's a few places in Portland where cyclists are given priority, and you just had any thoughts about how much of an impact that might have?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, for two reasons, because you know, you see two effects with the traffic signal. There's a pure delay effect, regardless of what the intersection is like. They would rather ride a route with fewer traffic signals in general. But when it provides protection, they'll seek that out. But it doesn't necessarily mean they like it. So one that reacts quicker can sort of reduce that just base effect of a traffic signal slowing you down, but still sort of provide the protection from cross traffic and allow you to make more turning maneuvers. So yeah, I think those reactive signals for cyclists are a good thing, at least from the point of view of the model. Yeah.
First of all, I like your enthusiasm and I like your presentation, so nice job. You mentioned that different degrees of uphill slope created different levels of impedance. I was wondering if you thought that different levels of downhill slope actually made a route more attractive to cyclists.
Yeah, good. Very good question. No, the short answer is no. There wasn't any discernible effect of them, say, seeking out either steeper or longer downhills. And maybe part of that is that it's a rare route where you can just find the steeper downhill on one side, but not get the uphill on the other. And then with pedestrians, it sort of seemed like when you're walking, hey, uphill's still more energy, but downhill's it's not always that pleasant. But no, there was not that symmetric effect that you might expect to find. It's completely asymmetric in the uphill direction. Pedestrians didn't seem to avoid even very steep downhill slopes. So, yeah, good question, and one I thought of too, but it's a conundrum for now. Yeah.
Diane, how did you deal with the complex crossings of pedestrians? Because you said that the GPS wasn't so clear.
Right.
So, did you have them reconfirm the routes or anything like that?
No, I did not have that luxury, and it would have been a lot of routes. But what I did was just apply a consistent logic to each pedestrian. So I essentially each time they sort of entered a new street, they only were a new straight stretch, they got one crossing, right, until they made another move, until they turned or something, because I thought it was unrealistic that they would cross back and forth even to sort of access infrastructure. So what I tried to do, given the data and resources I had, was just be consistent with everyone. And it would be great to be able to know which side they're on, but the GPS is just not there, particularly when there are buildings or trees around. It bounces too much. So I gave them what I thought was reasonable. So they got one crossing on every new street. That's it there. Yeah.
Gerald Fittipaldi. I'm not in the class, but that's fine.
Nice to meet you anyway.
I just have a comment on the bike lanes. It seemed like bike lanes weren't attracting cyclists as much as we might expect.
Yeah.
And I lived in Washington, D.C. for the past 2 years, and one of the biggest differences I'm noticing is the bike lanes themselves and the parking spaces were wider. So from the curb face to the outer bike lane stripe was about 2 feet wider than you'd find in a lot of streets in Portland.
Right.
So here, a good example is Broadway downtown or 47th Northeast.
Okay.
Very tight squeeze.
Yes.
You pretty much have to ride in the door zone if you're in the bike lane.
Sure.
And so I actually go pretty far out of my way to avoid riding on those bike lane streets.
Yeah.
But in D.C., it was the opposite. I would go out of my way to get to those bike lanes because...
Got you. And that brings up a good limitation with the data I have, maybe it'll be in Metro's next data release on width of bike lane. But in the data, a bike lane is a bike lane and a bike path is a bike path. But we all know that, the Springwater versus, say, the West Side riverfront path they're kind of completely different beasts, right? But that'll be bike model 3.0. We have that width data everywhere. It's a good point, though, that facilities aren't all the same just because of the name. Yeah. Chris?
I was wondering if you had observations about if you saw any trips that were sort of somebody came one way by bike and then went the return trip by another road, and if that would give you any kind of clue about any other route.
Yeah. I am looking into that because I've done the tour formation. A challenge is that I've mentioned a couple of times. I didn't go into detail because I can get lost in it, but we didn't have diaries, and so we're not. We have the modes with a probability. We are 80% confident this person's on a bike, and so you see some really complex mode chains sometimes, and it's probably not. It's probably not real. They're not really flipping back from bike and walking back. But that's a good point to look at that more closely. And in the mode choice model, the tour variables are going to be there because I want to capture things like someone might have a downhill roll to work, but if you think of the whole tour back home, they're in their mind thinking about I got to get back up that hill, and so I think that's something kind of similar maybe. Yeah. And that's, it's got to be a deterrent. Even if you have another option, there's a cost in, putting your bike on transit or getting a ride or whatever. So, yeah, I'm looking more and more closely, especially in the mode choice component at those tour chains and everything. Be sure to stay in touch. And I didn't put my email up, but you can look me up. Search for me on PDX. I've been here long enough. I'm on every page. Anything else? I think we're about at the end. So, unless there's a web question, yes. All right.